Based on the neurotransmitter they produce and release, autonomic neurons can be classified as either cholinergic or adrenergic. The receptors for the transmitters are proteins located within the cell membrane of the postsynaptic neuron or effector cell. So cholinergic receptors can be divided into nicotinic and muscarinic receptors. Cholinergic receptors are integral membrane proteins in the postsynaptic plasma membrane. So the cell membrane of the cell after the synapse, right? The two types of cholinergic receptors both bind to acetylcholine. They are nicotinic and muscarinic. Nicotinic receptors are present in the cell membrane of the dendrites and cell bodies, both of sympathetic and parasympathetic postganglionic neurons. We also find some nicotinic receptors in the adrenal medulla, which is going to release epi and norepi, and in the motor end plate of neuromuscular junctions. These, you may be wondering, nicotinic receptors, why in the world would we have receptors named for nicotine? Well, they're named because nicotine mimics the action of acetylcholine when it binds these receptors. So nicotine is a naturally occurring substance in tobacco leaves, but it's not naturally occurring in humans, and of course it's not present in non-smokers. But when nicotine binds those receptors, it functions the same as the acetylcholine. Muscarinic receptors are found in the cell membranes of all effectors, the smooth muscle, the cardiac muscle, the glands. So all of these effectors that are innervated by parasympathetic postganglionic axons. These receptors are named because there's a mushroom poison called muscarine, and it mimics the effect of acetylcholine when it binds to them. So nicotine doesn't activate the muscarinic receptors, and muscarinic receptors can't bind or activate the nicotinic receptors. So what else do we need here? When these nicotinic receptors are excited by acetylcholine, it causes depolarization and excitation of that postsynaptic cell. So that's with the nicotinic receptors. Activation of the muscarinic receptors when acetylcholine binds to it sometimes causes depolarization, which leads to excitation, sometimes causes hyperpolarization, which can inhibit that cell from firing. So it depends on what receptors a particular cell has. For example, acetylcholine binding to muscarinic receptors relaxes or inhibits contraction of smooth muscle cells that form sphincters in the gastrointestinal tract. On the other hand, acetylcholine excites muscarinic cells or excites smooth muscle fibers in other areas of the body, such as the circular muscles that contract and relax the iris. So depending on the receptor type and the tissue type, these neurotransmitters can have very different action. In the autonomic nervous system, the adrenergic neurons release norepinephrine, sometimes called noradrenaline. Molecules of noradrenaline diffuse across the synaptic cleft and bind to specific adrenergic receptors on the postsynaptic membrane, where it may cause excitation or inhibition of that cell. Adrenergic receptors bind to norepinephrine and epinephrine. The norepinephrine can either be released as a neurotransmitter by the sympathetic postganglionic neurons, or it can be released as a hormone by the cells in the adrenal medulla. So when the adrenal medulla releases epinephrine, it's released as a hormone. If the nervous system is releasing it, the epinephrine is a neurotransmitter. This, of course, gives you, when you have both of these, think about that initial fight or flight response, right? That adrenaline rush. That's going to be because the sympathetic nervous system is going to release epi and norepi very quickly, and that gives you that quick burst of energy, what we call the adrenaline rush. But if you truly do have to fight or flight, you've got to get away from that bear in the woods, or you've got to fight that bear in the woods, you're going to need a much longer burst of energy, and that happens when the sympathetic nervous system stimulates the adrenal gland to release epi and norepi, and of course that's released in the blood as a hormone, and that gives you a much, much longer quote-unquote energy rush. Alright, so the two main types of adrenergic receptors are alpha receptors and beta receptors. They're classified into these subtypes based on their specific responses and selective binding of certain drugs or chemicals that activate or block them. So most of the effectors of the sympathetic nervous system are going to contain either alpha or beta receptors, but there are some effectors that contain both. So norepi stimulates alpha receptors more strongly than beta receptors, and epinephrine is a potent stimulator of both of these types of receptors. So the responses, again, to the norepinephrine can either be excitatory or inhibitory based on the tissue and the receptor. So beta receptors in the heart are going to be bound by epinephrine and increase the heart rate. Beta receptors in the airways, in the bronchioles, are going to reduce constriction or contraction of the muscles, thereby dilating and keeping those airways open. Let's take a quick look at how some drugs can provide inhibition or excite some of these organs that possess the receptors. So parasympathetic drugs include atropine, which is an anticholinergic, so it blocks acetylcholine and therefore the parasympathetic effects of that, and it helps to dry up saliva during surgery. So that of course allows for those salivary glands to stop secreting the excess saliva. Makes it a lot easier, of course, for the surgeon not to have to be wiping up drool all the time, right? There are other benefits to that as well, but we really don't have to get too deep into that. And ophthalmologists will often use atropine to dilate the pupils, and once those pupils are dilated, of course, that allows the ophthalmologist to look deeper into the eye and see some of the structures within as well as some of the vasculature and look for abnormalities. A side effect of the atropine is that it does increase heart rate. So by blocking acetylcholine, remember acetylcholine slows down cardiac muscle contraction. So if you block that activity, then the heart rate does tend to increase. The neostigmine is an anticholinesterase, which means that it prevents the enzyme acetylcholine esterase from being able to break down acetylcholine. So that means acetylcholine stays in the synapse longer, therefore it has prolonged effects. This is sometimes used in a muscular disorder known as myasthenia gravis. In myasthenia gravis, the muscle activity is impaired, weakened, or slowed due to a lack or defect in those acetylcholine receptors. So as the acetylcholine esterase, the enzyme is breaking down acetylcholine, there's even less opportunity for the few functioning receptors to bind that acetylcholine. So by keeping it in the synapse longer, that allows for a little bit of prolonged activity of that acetylcholine. In the sympathetic nervous system, nicotine stimulates those nicotinic receptors and causes an increase in heart rate and therefore increasing blood pressure. So the faster the heart is beating, more blood is being pushed out into the vessels at any given time, and that blood then is pushing harder against the vessels and increasing blood pressure. Drugs that prolong norepinephrine activity can help to relieve depression. So certain classifications of drugs known as MAOIs, which are monoamine oxidase inhibitors, if you're wondering, prevent the norepinephrine from being broken down. So again, it remains in the synapse longer, able to stimulate those postsynaptic cells for a longer period of time. Over-the-counter drugs that you may take for colds or allergies can mimic sympathetic stimulation of the alpha receptors, and by doing so, they can alter the blood flow to specific tissues and therefore especially mucous membranes, and can help to dry up some of those secretions that lead to the runny nose, the postnasal drip, and the cough that sometimes is triggered because of that drainage. And then beta blockers. A lot of people that have high blood pressure may take beta blockers, or if there's another cardiovascular disease or disorder, depending on what it is. So it's not a cure-all. But because the beta cells, when they are bound to neurotransmitters, they are going to be excited and increase the rate and the force of contraction. So if you take a drug that binds to those receptors, therefore blocking the beta receptors from binding neurotransmitters, then that is going to, of course, reduce that heart rate and can help prevent arrhythmias, so irregular heart rate.